I do need to come over there and to go look at some stuff.
Absolutely.
So ready to go?
Hello everyone. My name is Nasser Abad and I'm the convener of this lecture series, the AKPIA lecture series. This semester we do have, this is the first event of the semester. This semester we do have quite a busy semester, and as I always do, I brought some copies of the poster for those of you who haven't seen it. It's designed by Jose Luis Arguello, and I want you to admire the art of it. More than anything else, I'll tell you about the content. I have 3 copies for those of you who are in dorms, public buildings, whatever, that can actually take it and hang it. I'll leave the copies here. So today we have the event with Allison Cuneo, and on 11th of March we have our second event, which is a presentation by a pair, husband and wife architects from India. And then we have 2 panel discussions scheduled one after the other. One on the 8th of April, and it is with the artist Julie Mehretu from New York City, and before that from Ethiopia, with a couple of scholars that we invited to be with her. She has been recently working on representations that relate to the Arab Spring, and she has produced 2 pieces, one on Cairo and one on Damascus, that are fetching astronomical numbers in the art market. And then the next panel discussion is on the 29th of April, and it is around a new book that just came out on the Gulf City, entitled The New Arab Urban Gulf Cities of Wealth, Ambition and Distress, edited by Harvey Moloch and Davide Ponzini. And we also are inviting a couple of scholars who work on the Gulf region and the 2 authors to have a discussion around the book. The last event of the semester is a conference in May, and it is on the 10th and the 11th of May in room 6120. This is a Friday and a Saturday, and the title is Reconstruction as Violence, the Case of Aleppo, and it's being co-organized by me and Dean Sharp, our other postdoc for the year. We hope that you could make it to some of these presentations, and I'll leave these posters here, just in case anyone is interested. Today, our first speaker is Allison Cuneo, a postdoc with us this year and an archaeologist by training, specializing in critical heritage studies. Her field work is in northern Iraq, and her research centers on cultural heritage destruction, international heritage management policy and practice, and community-based participatory research. She has conducted archaeological and ethnographic field work in Greece, England, and Spain, and has held management roles in numerous government-funded programs. From 2012 to 2015, she was the program manager for a U.S. Embassy Baghdad University linkage program between Mosul University and Boston University. From 2015 to 2018, she served as project manager for the Cultural Heritage Initiative at the American Schools of Oriental Research here in Boston. Allison earned her bachelor degree in archaeology, classical Greek philology, and art history from Dickinson College, and her master's degree in archaeological heritage management from Boston University. Her thesis analyzed the impact of U.S. military intervention on cultural property in Iraq and Afghanistan, and evaluated the efficacy of cultural resource management policies implemented by the U.S. government in response to those 2 conflicts. And her doctoral dissertation in archaeology, entitled Heritage Management Challenges and Changes in Northern Iraq After the Fall of Saddam Hussein, the Rise of Kurdistan and the Islamic State Onslaught, studied how various stakeholders in Iraq constructed and exploited cultural heritage for political power. Since earning her PhD, Allison has founded her own independent consultancy, Cultural Property Consultants, and leads 2 multi-institutional cultural heritage projects in Iraq. And she actually keeps on going to Iraq while she's supposed to be with us here. She is directing community-centered archaeology activities for the Rwandus archaeological program in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. She is also a co-principal investigator for the Mosul Heritage Stabilization Program. Her talk tonight is entitled Rebuilding Architectural Heritage in Post-Conflict Mosul, Current Challenges, Considerations, and Case Studies. In it, she is drawing on recent field work in Mosul and the Nineveh Plains. And she explores the modalities of state-sponsored preservation initiatives. She will outline the various cultural preservation projects active in Mosul and the surrounding area to identify the constraints of protecting architectural heritage during post-conflict reconstruction and examine the socio-political implications of repairing cultural sites impacted by armed conflicts. Please join me in welcoming Allison.
Thank you, Nasser. Thank you, Jim, for having me here for this year. And so I hope all those trips to Iraq are worth it. We'll find out. And so today I want to talk about specifically the post-conflict or post-ISIS situation in Mosul and the surrounding area, specifically drawing on my experience there working as a investigator for monitoring, reporting, and fact-finding missions that were taking place during the conflict, where we were conducting mostly remote assessments of the damage taking place in these areas, as well as now, most recently, and one that I hadn't intended to do when I first started this postdoc is actually go on the ground and compare notes to my experience previously and what I'm seeing now. So what I would like to go over in this talk today is just a brief summary of the type of conflict damage that has taken place as a result of the war to try to eliminate ISIS, locally known as Daesh, or the Islamic State, from northern Iraq between 2014 when they first invaded the Mosul area until 2017 when they were officially declared defeated. I will then move on to talking about current post-conflict reconstruction efforts, both within the wider context of the entire city in terms of civil society, security, but also within the framework of heritage preservation initiatives. Specifically, though, I'm going to go a little bit in detail, depending on how much time I have left, into what I'm doing with my new project, the Mosul Heritage Stabilization Program, which I just started in October 2018, and fully was not planning to have this in my talk, but here we are today. And then finally, I want to give a bit of a summary, a synopsis of what I'm seeing on the ground, both in terms of what types of narratives are being presented from the primary stakeholders who are in charge of these larger heritage preservation initiatives, and how they sometimes contrast with what we're actually seeing on the ground. A few disclaimers as I go through this. Primarily, I want to reiterate that my remarks are my own personal views. I do have funding from the U.S. Department of State, so I just want to make it clear that those are not, anything that I say is not reflective of the U.S. Department of State, the U.S. government's opinions. I take full responsibility for what I say. You can come at me later. I also want to talk about, I would try in my talk to limit the amount of destruction imagery that I use, specifically because I've had a very real problem with the way in which the conflict has been talked about, and how there has been this almost fetishization of damage and violence and trauma, and how many of these narratives that talk about Mosul really are, in a way, I feel, holding the city and its people back by focusing just on that violence. So I try to limit the destruction imagery to what is just explicitly necessary to describe the situation. And usually that means I'm going to primarily use my own photographs. And then additionally, for the protection of the privacy of the subjects that I have taken, unless I've had their explicit permission, I block out faces, so I don't try to take civilian shots. And if I do, then I hide that person's privacy. And finally, in terms of imagery and any of the kind of points I'm talking about, I include the citation of the website that I am citing. So we can go back later if you have questions about the article in which I'm talking about or where I'm pulling from. This is going to be, as I understand, recorded, but you can come to me later and I can share this information with you. So I would like to at least start off with giving a rundown, a brief summary as best I can about the conflict damage that has taken place. And so one of the primary discussions that has come up in the cultural destruction that has taken place in Mosul is the intentional destruction perpetrated by the Islamic State. And many of the narratives that arise when discussing Islamic State intentional cultural property destruction has been primarily focused on their ideology. Specifically, it's kind of iconoclastic ideology rooted within Sunni, Salafi, Wahhabi, very extreme considerations or interpretations of Sunni Islam. And again, the primary focus has been specifically looking at ISIS as being a either erratic state, non-state actor that is a fanatic, a religious fanatic or extremist. However, there are very specific rules in which ISIS has followed when they practice this performative destruction. And at the same time, though, I think that there's been a lack of consideration, at least for beyond the iconoclasm and the theology, but also the economic and tactical benefits of destruction of cultural property. And so here I have their very public displays that they've incorporated into the propaganda machine. This is a specific issue of Dabak, issue 8, that talks about the destruction of the Mosul Museum. And it shows specifically the types of why they're attacking it, and also provides a very thorough theological basis for their actions. And through other analysis that I've done in the past, what is not shown on camera has been the exploitation of cultural property through illicit trafficking. So there's actually funding terrorist activities using this type of activity, and using these broadcasts to obscure their other mechanisms of profiting. But also they're using this type of activity to obscure their defeats as well. And much of that isn't necessarily talked about. Mostly the narrative when it comes to ISIS cultural destruction is it's tied to cultural cleansing and the eradication of universal heritage. And so in a way, this does bear truth. ISIS is one of the sole actors involved in intentional cultural property destruction, or at least public displays of it. This is data collected by the American Schools of Oriental Research Cultural Heritage Initiatives between 2014 and 2017. And in terms of intentional cultural destruction, which we defined as when the perpetrator admits fault and admits intentionality, which again, when you're talking about typical belligerents or traditional militaries, usually they will never admit that they intentionally destroyed a cultural site in retribution. However, within that, even if there isn't open intentionality or at least admittance of fault, we do still have incidents where retributory violence has taken place, and we've been able to document that. But ISIS, by far, has been the primary perpetrator of intentional destruction. And then in terms of the types of discussions when it comes to cultural property destruction, the narrative that comes out, particularly in American and European discussions, is the focus on ancient pre-Abrahamic sites, Palmyra, Nimrud, when in fact the reality of the ground demonstrates that majority of the sites that have been attacked intentionally by the Islamic State are or actively used places, attached to living populations, local communities. And so you can see here, religious sites or monuments are predominantly the main place that has been, the main category of type site that has been attacked. And then within that, when the discussion does turn to attacks on religious or ethnic plurality, the center is mostly on ethnic and religious minorities, Christians, Yazidis, Turkmen, Shabak, Shia, and by and large, yes, this does reflect the situation. And especially, I think what the limitation of this pie graph is that it doesn't actually show the proportionality of population. So yes, Christians take up about 25% of the damaged sites. However, when you think about it in terms of the proportion of Christian populations within wider Iraq, the damage is much more punctuated within that local community. However, one aspect of the conflict that isn't well discussed or even acknowledged as openly is the destructive capacity that aerial bombardment and that has had on cultural heritage and just the conflict in general. And so one of the problems that I have with the presentation of many of the discussions of cultural heritage reconstruction is a lack of acknowledgement of what the war against ISIS has inflicted on cities like Mosul. And so this is an example of some of the attempts to hold traditional national militaries accountable in this. This is from the nonprofit organization Air Wars, and they have been attempting to tally the number of airstrikes and casualties the result of this conflict against the Islamic State, because it seems as though the U.S. military, or at least the U.S.-led coalition, joint force coalition, has not been keeping accurate tabs on the number of casualties inflicted by the conflict, as well as the number of strikes launched. And so you can see over time, as the war against ISIS, their numbers are dwindling and their territory is decreasing, but the number of airstrikes that are taking place are significantly increasing over time. And so the way in which the war against the Islamic State had played out, it started outwards and then worked its way inwards, centering in the end on Old City Mosul. This is a GIF provided by BBC that they had put together from multiple sources, but I think it highly demonstrates how small the conflict area in Mosul starts to shrink and how much it's representative of the concentration of the conflict in its final days. And so, in a way, this is reflected in the heritage damage that is taking place in this time period. And so this is a graph that shows in the last end of the reporting for ASOR cultural heritage initiatives in the first half of 2017, specifically around the time when the war against the Islamic State in Iraq was starting to dwindle. You can see in the bottom too that military activities, explosives and airstrikes, and then also explosives, we separate between the two, airborne versus groundborne, are the predominant cause of damage in both Syria and Iraq. And so I think it's important to remember that this is combining the two countries together. However, this was at the time when the war against ISIS was starting to finally ratchet up. And this is when we start to see a significant increase in aerial bombardment in the old city of Mosul. And you can see, as a result of Islamic State's significantly shrinking territory, intentional destruction is one of the much smaller components of destruction activity. And so as the conflict coalesced in the old city, the extent of damage, you can see, multiplies. An old city of Mosul is one of the longest inhabited areas in northern Iraq. Mosul was Iraq's second largest city, and many of the structures, historic structures that were still standing in Mosul at the time, dated back between Ottoman era, so 1800s, to even as old as 1,000 years old. And so this, you can see at least a demonstration of the types of strikes that are taking place in such a concentrated area. And this is because as the Islamic State started to bunker down and prepare for an onslaught, what they had done was use the intricate nature of the old city urban planning, specifically its winding small alleyways, to their advantage. And many of them knew that the way in which this war was waged was using aerial satellite imagery and drones. So many had taken either taken steps to cover their alleyway so that it made it difficult for them to see, their movements, or built a number of tunnels. And so these considerations, especially the tunnels that have undermined many of the foundations, are what made these aerial bombardments even more catastrophic, because the undermined foundation would completely collapse even without a direct hit. And so as a result, though, because of this, in such a highly populated area, especially in part of the city that was one of the least economically privileged of the city, there were a number of casualties as a result, and many of which are not documented by the U.S. coalition, which is one of the real problems with the way in which this conflict is discussed, because especially in terms of aerial bombardment and drone strikes, this war is seen to be hygienic. And the only real atrocities and people that it is being inflicted upon is the Islamic State. But the civilian casualties have not been fully documented, and it's taken a number of separate investigations from different journalists working in the area to try to come up with some sort of tally. And I'm going to avoid, I was going to show this video, but I think I'm a little too high-key emotional right now to be able to put it up. But at least what different nonprofit organizations are attempting to do now is discuss not only just the atrocities committed by the Islamic State, which we know very, very well, but also look at the failure that national militaries have been able to respond appropriately to this type of conflict. And because of their negligence in many ways, there has been a significant increase in civilian casualties that was probably not necessary. So we can go back to this video maybe later when I'm feeling a little bit more grounded. So within this context, post-conflict reconstruction is incredibly difficult. The nature of the conflict that was waged has resulted in massive amounts of debris and damage that now Iraq faces cleaning up. And in many ways, Iraq is trying to seek out international solicitations to assist with that with certain degrees of success. With assistance from the World Bank, Iraq and Kuwait held this international conference last February to solicit funds from national partners and independent economic outlets to support redevelopment in former ISIS territories, not just Mosul, but Anbar, Fallujah, parts of Baghdad, Salahuddin, Tikrit, Kirkuk, and what they were aiming for was about $88 billion, but the resulting amount of money that was raised is only a fraction of that, which many outside experts say is reflective of a bit of a failure. Within the report that was provided by Iraq and presented during this conference was the National Reconstruction and Development Framework, which is laying out exactly how these funds were calculated, so the estimates for damage and the estimates for reconstruction funds, as well as how the funds would be broken down. And you can see as a component of that, the amount of damage that was inflicted on specifically the heritage and tourism sector as compared to, say, housing. And you think about that in terms of defining from the UNESCO standpoint, outstanding universal value. How can you put a numeric financial marker on a site like Nimrud? But somehow they were able to do it. Bureaucrats always find a way. And then looking at the amount that they are expecting to spend over time is incredibly significant. But think about it within the context of wider initiatives, and this is just one section. There's security to consider, economic development, civil society. This is a very, very small component. However, it was taken into account by the Iraqi government. And it shows the short-term and long-term prioritizations for cultural heritage reconstruction in there. However, one of the things that I noticed in reading through this document is a lack of integration between wider civil society projects and cultural heritage. They're siloed in a way. There's no conception of what Old City used to be like, where you have old historic houses considered to be historically significant. But they served as domestic spaces for actual living community members. This type of intersection is not necessarily discussed in these bureaucratic economic documents. There is one sentence mentioned that, within terms of housing, that designs for inclusive national housing reconstruction schemes should promote inclusivity, equity, and transparency while safeguarding housing stock with cultural heritage value. What cultural heritage value means is not defined. And it's interesting, again, when talking about specifically cultural heritage, the narrative again turns to specifically just acknowledging deliberate destruction as the main cause of damage. There's no discussion about the way in which asymmetric warfare is waged, how aerial bombardment is used. Again, it places the entirety of the blame on the Islamic State, rather than holding national militaries with an air force accountable. And so, within this context, locally, even the politics make it very difficult for Reconstruction to progress. On the left, you have Naufal Hamdani Sultan Agub, the governor of Nineveh, and on the right, you have, the head of Mosul municipalities, Abdul Sattar al-Hibul. There are two main people who are charged with reconstruction in Mosul. Governor Nawal is in charge of the entire Nineveh governorates and the entire province, and then Abdul Sattar is just in charge with Mosul. However, they both have butted heads in terms of allocation of resources, and especially funding. And Governor Nawal has been charged multiple times on allegations of corruption. He was suspended from office for 2 months in December 2017 on charges of fraud, kidnapping, and torturing 3 journalists. And yet he was still able to hold his position even today. And so as a result, many of these two are in the press quite often, exchanging barbs with regard to how the progress of Mosul seems to be apparently too slow for anyone's taste, which is certainly the case in many ways. And so tensions definitely came to a head in Mosul last month, January 2019, when this man, Ahmed Ibrahim Mohammed, a Maslawi carpenter, provided testimony in front of the Iraqi Council of Representatives. He first gained attention within local media while documenting the progress of the reconstruction in the old city. And Mr. Ahmed's impassioned frustration about the lack of progress went viral. And so he was invited to speak in Baghdad, where he broke down in tears about the lack of employment, housing, water, infrastructure, and how residents are still facing these problems years after liberation. And so he was quite a compelling, real testimony to what the situation is on the ground, in comparison, in contrast to, say, what is presented at the Kuwait Council, Financial Council. And so right after his testimony, the same day, there were several news agencies were concerned that the Governor Nawal, would start to ban journalists from coming to the old city of Mosul on the grounds that the area was being demined and is unsafe. But ostensibly it was because he didn't want anyone to be showing how bad the situation was. And according to those agencies, journalists began to solicit requests for access to the governor's office, all of which were predominantly denied. And then a few days later, on January 22nd, Mosul police arrested 3 crew members from Al Masaliwa television station. These are the folks here. While they were reporting in the old city, and they were taken to the specific headquarters of the emergency police regime, which is a special police force that has been deployed by the governor, again, just for emergency situations, but they've been there for at least 2 years now. And incidentally, while these men were detained, it was because they were actually trying to report on the reopening of the markets as a sign of progress, that things were changing. And journalists were actually asked by the police to sign a paper saying they would never film in the old city again, and they refused. Fortunately, 11 hours later, they were released, unharmed. However, that didn't stop Governor Nawal from balking at the allegations of mismanagement and corruption and the slow rate of progress in the old city. And so I think that what the reality is on the ground is that it's undoubtedly unsurprising that progress is slow in the old city simply for the logistical concerns, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But minority groups are slow to return to places they once inhabited, both within the city of Mosul but also the surrounding areas. Popular mobilization forces, which are the militia groups that sprung up in response to the Islamic State, many of which have different sectarian affiliations, control much of the security, especially in Mosul. The predominant forces are Shabak Shia, which is in contrast to a predominantly Sunni majority in the city of Mosul. And this situation should have been alleviated. The elimination of the emergency police as well as the popular mobilization force control should have been handed over to the Iraqi security forces months ago, but they still remain, most likely because of the governor's request that it does. And at the same time, you have the city processing the crimes that ISIS has committed, and the trials that are taking place, the criminal trials taking place against ISIS members. And it's a very difficult situation because documentation efforts of these crimes are minimal because of the extent of the damage. And so many people are being accused of ISIS affiliation without much documented proof, and yet are still being sentenced. There was an excellent article in the New Yorker a few weeks ago by Ben Taub that talks about the problems associated with this, and that there's a concern that with all of these factors in play, the city of Mosul could potentially become a powder keg. And this is the context in which we heritage preservationists need to work within, unfortunately, and keep in mind much of this, this information. And so heritage and war, the intersection of these two, has captured international imagination, and the ISIS narrative is especially compelling. These black-clad, alien foreign fighters coming in and just wantonly destroying ancient archaeological sites that should be respected by all. And it's one that different corporations have latched onto. Google is one example, and which has partnered with the World Monuments Fund to create 3D exhibitions as well as or online exhibitions and 3D reconstructions. As well as Microsoft, which is using cultural heritage of war as a plug for its artificial intelligence. I want to show at least a new spot that is out featuring our good friend Comet, which portions of this actually aired during the Super Bowl this year.
Right now, historical sites are disappearing, but artificial intelligence can help us bring history back to life.
If you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you go, we use Microsoft AI to help us reproduce historical places.
I need to make it possible because it's so important to do. To recreate the sites, we had to stitch hundreds of pictures one by one.
With Microsoft Artificial Intelligence,
we are able to stitch hundreds of thousands of pictures in one night. Before, it was just a representation of the site. With this technology, you can go in, you can experience it.
Let's go in another place. I'm ready for the next one.
Artificial intelligence lets us experience our past. It helps us create our future.
And there are merits for virtual reconstruction, 3D reconstruction, absolutely. However, corporations using this as a platform to, advance their own agenda, especially AI being used for facial recognition software by the police. I mean, focusing specifically on cultural heritage and war and the conflict, that really, I have a lot of things to say, but I will limit my time. But one of the concerns I have with these types of exploitative whitewashing of this destruction is the fact that, in many ways, it completely sanitizes these heritage sites and removes any sort of living population from these places, and the impact that war has had on people surrounding these sites. And in some ways, these types of slick, 3D, remotely done assessments and analyses and presentations of these places continues on even in major organizations that are involved in cultural heritage reconstruction. UNESCO, in some ways, even mimics much of what the Microsoft advertisement has displayed in its own advertisements for the revival of the city of Mosul. And so this was an initiative launched in 2018 concerned with the reconstruction of the old city, specifically its infrastructure and the way it describes restoring the dignity of the people. And so I want to read a bit of a blurb from the website describing what the purpose is of Revive the City of Mosul. When war is waged against culture and education, response must be culture and education. This is only long-term solution against extremism. The destruction of the University of Mosul Library, the dynamiting of the Al-Hadba minaret, and the pillaging of the Nabi Yunus shrine, emblem of religious coexistence of all three religions of the book, shocked the world. Public libraries were burnt, music was silenced, artists attacked, and cafes closed. Thousands of children have learned war, and they've been indoctrinated with intellectually corrupt ideology. They have not received an education, the essential tool for building the future. To avoid raising a lost generation, we must teach peace but also reinfuse these communities with culture of peace, steeped in Iraq's rich history and cultural life. Through culture and education, we can restore trust and create the conditions for a common future. This reconstruction will take time, but brick by brick, lesson by lesson, together we can revive the true spirit of Mosul. See some narratives that have been replayed, specifically focusing on extremist ideology, the impact of ISIS only. Aerial bombardment, not necessarily so much. And this is the launch video that UNESCO had released during its first conference that it had on the city of Mosul. And one of the things I want to highlight that this video fails to show really is life. There's no one here. These places are abandoned. They're ruined. No one lives there if you look at this. At least that's what you would assume. That no one uses these places. They're all taken from the air, remotely, nothing from on the ground. It's all drone footage. The only occasional sign of life is honking horns from the traffic. And so it begs the question, if you're going to rebuild these places and emphasize how the reconstruction is meant to revive the spirit of Mosul, who is it for if you're not showing anyone reaping the benefits of this? And so it's not necessarily fair to say that all of UNESCO's advertising is like this. They have taken great strides to emphasize the connection between living populations, culture, education. But I thought it was most telling that one of their first spots that they decided to show is something like this. And so in the wake of the Revival City of Mosul initiative, one of their primary projects has been the reconstruction of the Al-Nouri mosque and the Al-Hadba minaret. And so this was the result of a large funding injection from the United Arab Emirates, as well as with supplemental funds from France, to rebuild the site, which is one of the last places that Daesh had held prior to its official defeat in Mosul. And so this was a site in one of the most hard-hit areas of the city of Mosul. It really was, when you saw that BBC GIF of the map, that last red dot, this is where it was. And so there was a massive ceremony involved in both the signing of the agreement between the United Arab Emirates and the government of Iraq, and just recently, back in December, they had an official cornerstone ceremony held on site at the Al-Nouri Mosque. And so, however, it's interesting that this has become one of the main projects that UNESCO has taken on, because especially within consideration that this was the final site that Daesh eliminated, one where there were dozens of human shields being locked into the mosque that were killed as a result of its destruction. How ISIS probably, in many ways, had initially attempted to shift blame on the coalition forces for its destruction rather than taking ownership of it. And it's one of the largest and oldest Sunni mosques in the city of Mosul. And Sunni cultural property was not necessarily largely targeted by Islamic State militants. It's an interesting intersection that doesn't necessarily reflect the wider population of Mosul, nor is it one that many Moslawis had at least a religious attachment to it. They had a symbolic or a separate way. It was a city symbol rather than a religious symbol. But the goal of this project is to turn it back into an active mosque. And there are strides being taken by UNESCO in collaboration with UN Habitat to interact with local residents and to involve them in the process in some way. This is a recent stakeholder meeting that was held in the Old City of Mosul to present the initial planning framework for the reconstruction of Mosul. And so this shows the integration between UN Habitat, UNDP, and UNESCO attempting to rebuild within the Old City. And so as far as I know, this is the first one that they've had. I haven't seen if they've held any since then. But it does show that there are some steps being taken to engage local populations. However, it seems as though, at least in my opinion, it's limited at the time, which is understandably respective of the nature on the ground. You can't involve local opinion at every step of such a wide, citywide process. In the wake of the Revive the City of Mosul campaign, a number of initiatives have sprung up specifically devoted to responding to cultural heritage crises as broadly defined. And one of these is the Olive Foundation, which came in the wake of the signing of the Al-Nouri Mosque agreement. And this is an international funding organization chaired by Thomas S. Kaplan that has $77.5 million in contributions from Dr. Kaplan, as well as fellow philanthropist Jean-Claude Gandour, as well as the Mellon Foundation, and the nations of France, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Mexico, and Luxembourg. And so they have been active most recently in trying to work with Mosul, specifically the Mosul Museum. They're one of the primary funders attempting to reconstruct this Mosul Museum, which is a collaboration between the Smithsonian Institution and the Louvre. And so they provided $480,000 to rehabilitate the museum. They also have provided some funds to the Smithsonian Cultural Rescue Initiative, which has provided about $400,000 to conduct groundwork and documentation efforts in the site of Nimrud, which you may recall was completely detonated by the Islamic State in 2015. And this has also received funds from the U.S. Department of State. And the primary effort of this is to implement immediate measures to stabilize the building and protect the collections that are left and prepare for restoration. And Aleph has also funded some of the efforts conducted by the French Christian NGO, Fraternité en Iraq, which predominantly is focused on Iraqi religious minorities, specifically within the Nineveh Plains region. They've been active since 2011, but one of their larger projects that they just completed has been Mar Beham Monastery, which was detonated by Islamic State in in March 2015. And this organization, with funds from Aleph, plans to focus on other Catholic churches, Al-Tahriya and the Church of St. Thomas in Mosul. And so these three Aleph-funded projects all, again, focus on sites that were explicitly destroyed by the Islamic State. Their sites, at least two of them, are largely far away from the city of Mosul, concerning, when you think about it in terms of logistics, it's a bit easier to work there. But also, they're focused on places that are, especially the Mosul Museum, sites that are, in a way, separated from living populations. Mar Beham is one of the only ones that's probably going to be actively used once again. And its initial mission that it received funds was to actually turn it back into an active place of worship. But many of these initial projects, again, are grand focus site-specific projects rather than holistic, integrative, cultural heritage, community-based projects that are deeply integrated into civil society rebuilding. These are all, in a way, islands, heritage islands, within a sea of civil society and security rebuilding. And despite these grand efforts to try to revive the city of Mosul, heritage destruction is still taking place because of the needs for reconstruction. This is just one example of a site, an Ottoman Khan that was destroyed. It was pretty well intact, and yet, despite its minimal damage comparatively to the surrounding area, it's being torn down. The demolition started back in February 2018. And when we were there in 2019, I don't have any photographs, unfortunately, for reasons I'll explain later. But the site, as we have heard, is being actually turned into a bank. And then other sites that were large symbols within the urban fabric. For instance, Mosul's National Insurance Company Museum. This was one of the tallest buildings in the city of Mosul. It was designed by Rifat Shadiri in 1966. Its construction was completed in 1966. It was one of the most beautiful modern skyscrapers that were skyscrapers in Mosul that was unfortunately heavily bombarded during the conflict, but it's unfortunately very well known for its usage within ISIS propaganda. This was the site that they used to toss people off the top of it for violations, especially in particular homosexuality. They like to feature this predominantly within their propaganda. But I thought it was I was concerned, or at least I was enheartened, but there would at least be some sort of effort to protect the site. In November 2018, a few days before I was able to actually go, there was a concert sponsored by USAID that featured Maestro Karim Wasfi, who is the famous cellist who has done these spontaneous concerts across Mosul as well as Iraq in places that were originally used for violence. And so it, in a way, was a way to demonstrate a movement to go beyond just what the Islamic State had done. Unfortunately, though, days later, you could see on the right, they had already began to just tear the site down. And you can see there is an orange line. If I can get. That is the crowd tape that was outlining the bounds of the concert, still up in place. And there are still unsubstantiated rumors circulating that destruction is still going to take place and that old city of Mosul is going to be completely stripped, flattened, rebuilt, made into a strip mall shopping center with high rises. And in many ways, there is concern that it will be turned into a new Beirut or a new Dubai, with all erasure except for a couple of heritage sites. So this was just circulating on social media about 2 weeks ago or so. However, unfortunately, it's been difficult to substantiate these claims, as many of these types of situations occur. And many of these these heritage projects have to take place within very difficult, overlapping, and challenging conditions. We're dealing with, especially in the Old City, massive amounts of debris and rubble that need to be removed. Infrastructure is lacking. Many places still lack electricity, water, sewage, making it difficult to actually even just drive in and clear the site. But we're also dealing with unexploded ordnance, which is especially dangerous, as well as human casualties to still remain in the rubble. And in terms of cultural heritage sites, there's the added factor of desecration. This is a recent event that came to a head at the end of January, around the time when we were there, when the UN Mine Action Service had been clearing the Al Tahrir Church, which is the one that that fraternity in Iraq wants to focus its effort on in the future. They were pushing rubble out of the way to create datum points, datum lines, which you need to use when you're clearing mines. And there were allegations that the demining crew had desecrated religious artifacts and had pushed debris into consecrated areas, which resulted, if you could, on the picture on the left, a confrontation between the deminers and the religious authorities. And so the Hammurabi Human Rights Organization had put out a press release talking about the desecration of the site, and UNMAS had to submit its own press release denouncing the allegations. And so this took place actually just a few days before we were accessing Mosul, which led to, which was around the same time that the journalist arrests were taking place, and there are allegations that the two are connected in some way. So I'll quickly go through the Mosul Heritage Stabilization Program and how this all fits together. Mahasib was initiated the result of a cooperative agreement funded by the U.S. Department of State, and this is a group that is founded by University of Pennsylvania's Near East Languages and Civilizations Department, my independent consulting firm, Cultural Property Consultants, and Mosul University's Engineering Consultancy and College of Archaeology. And so the initial funding comes from the Department of State Ambassador's Fund for Cultural Preservation and fits within a wider USAID initiative of $178 million to support ethnic and religious minorities in northern Iraq. And so our predominant focus within this first initial phase of the project is to conduct condition assessments, so ground-based assessments of damaged heritage sites, emergency response projects for places that are in need, site stabilization, which are larger multi-year projects to fully retrofit a site for active use, and stakeholder engagement. So our project focus is on Mosul and the surrounding areas, seen here. Specifically Nineveh governorate. But for logistical purposes, I think within this first phase of the project, we're going to focus on the city of Mosul and the Nineveh Plains because of issues of access. The Nineveh Plains were some of the first to be liberated and therefore better developed, making logistically it much easier to work in those areas. And so something that has a result made me reconsider and rethink these types of discussions I'm having is that my own project that I'm working on specifically, again, focuses on ethnic and religious minority groups, a very specific subset of Iraq. Again, a majority group that has been affected most proportionately by Islamic State cultural cleansing. I am playing into that same narrative that I have been trying to rail against for a long time, but I think one of the ways that I've been working through this and thinking about it is especially thank you for the U.S. Constitution and its First Amendment, the Establishment Clause. This means that we're going to be working on cultural sites that, yes, have a religious component, but also have cultural, historic, aesthetic, other sorts of associated heritage values with it. So, again, I think it's important to look at it as well, that we're going to be looking at sites that are specifically actively used by local populations with the purpose of rebuilding civil society and working within and enforcing local security structures. So this is the project area that we're specifically working within. And I'll just want to quickly show some of the couple of examples of some of the fieldwork that we conducted, just to exemplify many of the things that I've been talking about in terms of broader issues of access, damage, are quite, unfortunately, overwhelming when you're there on the ground. I think it's one thing to say it and to see it, but to walk amongst it, to drive through it, really does paint a bigger picture about what it's like to actually work within Mosul and to face some of the challenges that my peers are facing as well in terms of heritage projects. I can criticize them and critique them all they want, but we're working with extreme conditions here. And so I think that the fact that anyone is actually working on the ground is impressive. So this is just some of the examples of the amount of destruction. These sites have been, many of which have been hit many times by artillery strikes, but also internal vandalism as well. I think one of the noticed things, maybe an architect can tell me, specifically why domes tend to just pop off like that. We've seen that with just about every single church. If an airstrike hits it, the dome just kind of flips open like a tin can lid. Many of these sites, what we're finding, especially in terms of cultural heritage sites, have been repurposed. So they're not fully destroyed, but they've been reused. So this was actually a site that was likely made for the creation of IEDs, and we found a number of IED components all over the site. Probably was also used for housing. This site, Mar Efram, which is on the edge of one of the Christian neighborhoods in West Mosul, was used as the central bazaar for all of the confiscated property that Islamic State had collected from people who fled. This is where you can go and have a flea market. You could buy property, but also in the basement was the Hizbah court and prison. And so ISIS graffiti is still there and unclean, but there are still certain aspects that have been shockingly still intact. This is the dome within the same church that was left untouched. And the damage is extreme. I can't stress that enough. This is what we're working in. And I think it's incredibly revealing that there are expectations to restore cultural heritage sites when you have conditions like this in terms of housing and roads, that people still live amongst this. There are living communities still within it. And again, criticizing UNESCO, you can criticize my own photographs in terms of the lack of people, but I attempted to try to keep civilians out of it because I didn't want to, again, exploit them for the sake of damage or trying to emphasize the amount of damage. But this is where people live, and this is their daily life that they have to experience every day. And you can rebuild the Al-Nouri Mosque, certainly, but the roads are still going to be flooded. The shops are still pretty much closed. It's a difficult situation. And the political situation on the ground, too, in terms of the different types of conflict in place, the fight over power became evident in our most recent trip in January. We traveled to Mosul it was about, the news broke of the journalists' arrests 24 hours before we were supposed to leave. And when we traveled to Mosul, because it's a State Department grant, we have to travel with a predetermined security team, an armed security team. We have to wear body armor. We have to log an itinerary weeks in advance. And we can only be out dawn to dusk. And so any sort of last minute change is not necessarily a good thing. And so while we were preparing to leave, I was on the phone for the about 48 hours straight trying to talk with every single contact that I knew to make sure that when we showed up in Old City Mosul, we weren't going to get arrested. Fortunately, we had contacts within the Ministry of Culture who were incredibly helpful in putting us into contact with the Emergency Police Division, who provided us our own armed escort the whole day. And we had, under the watchful eyes of the mayor's, or the governor's police force, we were able to actually tour our sites. However, under these types of constraints, obviously we were not able to do everything that we had intended to do. We couldn't be as free in terms of our photography, our documentation efforts. And in the Nineveh Plains, the situation is the same. Development has been fast, more rapid than the old city of Mosul because of the lack of intense destruction and concentrated destruction, but the evidence still remains. The sites that have been rebuilt are rebuilt for a reason, because they're easy to do. This is from the town of Bartella. This is a year-round Christmas tree that they have at the edge of the town outside of the Shia Popular Mobilization Force checkpoint, which has the posters around the base of the tree are martyrs that were killed during the war against Daesh. And on the left is inside one of the rehabilitated churches. They kept one corner of the church as a memorial to the destruction. So they rebuilt the church completely, but they kept some of the pieces of iconography that were destroyed by Daesh, but also the area that was burnt. And people are rebuilding. This is a Shia Husainiya, a shrine that was rebuilt by the local Shabak population with funds from the local community. And so people are very eager to rebuild these sites, and they are when they are able to. But there are still massive amounts of destruction in place that are logistically very difficult to do without some sort of central organizing effort. So in conclusion, I think some of the issues that I've seen on the ground is that sectarian divisions of power, specifically, not just the Shia-Sunni divide, but even within the Christian communities, even, between civil society groups and religious hierarchies, it's difficult to gather stakeholder buy-in when you only have a limited amount of resources to spread amongst everyone. And so I think that the logistics in terms of trying to rebuild a site like Mosul and the Nineveh Plains are going to be very challenging and will remain so. It's overwhelming. We have demining to do, we have human remains burials to do, debris clearance, road building, and then you can actually access a site. Additionally, the rural-urban divide is very clear. Pre-ISIS resource allocation really deferred predominantly to urban spaces, leaving many rural sites to be neglected. And that was most clear in the Nineveh Plains. And so, especially in these more rural areas, it's going to be a challenge to try to direct funds to those areas, which are just in need as Mosul. And early success is reflective of less intensive damage, and that means that there's less challenging logistics, and the sites that still remain are still going to have a lot of difficult work ahead of them. Finally, destruction narratives that implicate ISIS are predominant in terms of funding allocation and also the direction of the attention. And what I think needs to be discussed a bit more openly is the impact that armed conflict in general has had on not only just cultural property, but also the human cost that armed conflict results in. And ultimately, heritage is just one factor in civil society rebuilding. And when I'm saying that, I'm reiterating that to heritage managers who go in. You are not just rebuilding a site, you have to work within civil society and security apparatuses in place. And I think the way in which the heritage post-conflict reconstruction situation has taken place years and years repeatedly is a clear division between heritage and everything else. And I think that there needs to be more integrated projects to help rebuild the city of Mosul or revive the spirit of Mosul. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have about my project as well as what I've talked about today. So thank you all very much for your attention.
You can feel your own questions.
Oh, that's worse. I'm sorry. Okay. And that was a bummer. Excuse me.
And area that I didn't see you sort of walk into. Did you walk into actually the area that's beyond the train station where there are modern villas or little houses rather than just in the city? And what was the condition there?
We didn't go out by the train station, so predominantly where we were in western Mosul.
Yeah.
We were predominantly in the extent of the Christian neighborhoods, as well as by Mosul University.
Yes.
That was where we went. And then in East Mosul, we predominantly stayed within the central most damaged area.
So you lived in the hills, basically, in the hill zone.
Yes. Yes. So we were
And
staying
that's the least bombed, the least damaged, probably.
in West Mosul, one of the least bombs in comparison.
Yeah.
The fighting had very quickly concentrated into the eastern side, which is where much of where we were working.
Okay. It's
much of
also the university side.
Yes, we did some of that.
How was that? Do you have any images or sense of how was it? Is it functioning? What's happening?
The university is functioning, despite being hit by airstrikes multiple times, and that was because the campus had been taken over by ISIS, and many of the university buildings had been used for chemical weapons factory, IED development. And then you have places like the Central Library that were completely gutted by Daesh intentionally. And so the sites that were very heavily destroyed with direct hits are still non-functioning. However, sites that were minorly damaged are up and running again. The repairs had taken place very quickly. We were there in November 2018 or so, and there were classes still in session. The university certainly has had to adjust because there are limited buildings that are functioning. Excuse me. But what they've done is staggered class times, so they're using, I think it was the College of Oil Engineering is housing multiple college classes in there instead of just the College of Oil. So they run classes from 7 a.m. until 8 p.m. to even 10 p.m. at night just to be able to host as many students as they can and hold their classes. So the university is functioning surprisingly well considering its conditions.
And students are on campus?
Yeah. Yes, they are.
Not
Actively.
in their homes, not commuting.
Oh, you're asking if they're living in dormitories on
Yes.
campus. I think that the dormitories are not as functioning. It's a very small proportion of students living on the dorms, many of which are living with their
So
families.
across there in the center of the city, did you visit any schools, or is there anything functioning?
Myself, we didn't go into schools. We weren't allowed to. But I was there, when I was there in January, it was still very much, when we went in November, it was a fall break or something, so schools were not in session. But in January, they're in full session, so we saw kids going to school quite a bit, and a number of, I think notable at least, were a number of girls' schools functioning very well. And there seemed to be, especially even in the old city where there was most damaged, the schools were, especially for primary school education, were very rapidly repaired. However, secondary school education is not as functioning as it was in the beginning. And I think that's by and large because many of those students have been pulled out of school and have not gone to school in such a long time. It's more difficult to bounce back and to go back to school again at such a later age. And many are now, because of the financial situations their families are facing, are going to work much earlier, at a much earlier age. So we would see many children out working in shops and they're 13 or so, which is much younger than expected.
Another, which is, this is not in heritage actually.
Can we ask?
Yes,
Can we get
okay.
other people to
Okay.
ask questions?
Your questions are very good ones. So, Allison, thanks very much for the presentation and for the kind of sense of realities that you have for this work. And I'm curious, I was writing down a little bit on this framework of condition assessment, emergency stabilization, stakeholder processes, that coupled with some of the conventions on conflict in the context of, or rather, conservation and reconstruction in the context of war-torn sites. There are these conventions and so on, which I imagine UNESCO and State Department are in alignment with. But would you say that there are some aspects of the, call it conceptual framework or approach, that are breaking some new ground, or seeking to do some of this work in innovative ways beyond, the conventions that we have, or taking into account additional perspectives from research or practice elsewhere? What do you see in the way of innovation in this context, or is it really trying to do the fundamentals as they've been defined in post-conflict reconstruction from recent decades?
Right. I think the short-term initiatives, especially, are very much adhered to, past established best practices, and so in terms of kind of very mandatory benchmarks of success, those are the kind of key targets that are attempted to hit. So specifically, site security, maintenance plan, emergency response, a very clear-cut sort of check marks need to be done. But I think what we're seeing now, especially in terms of sites that are heritage sites that are actively used, there is very much a focus and thankfully on community engagement. And I think that in terms of that component of that in the established international best practices is something that, in my opinion, has just been sort of like a bit of a cherry on top. It's like, oh, if you can engage the community, fantastic, that's great. That's just an extra bonus. It's not necessarily mandated. I think that now we're starting to see more of an integration of that component into a measurement of success, and that comes down to specifically sources of funding. And I think that was something that was rather striking from the U.S. State Department, is that stakeholder engagement and measurement of interaction is a piece of evaluation that we need to hit. That's a target we need to hit, and it's mandated, which I think before in other sites it hasn't been. And so I'm hoping to see that this will change as time goes on, that especially community-based participatory research practice, whether it be archaeological research, heritage management, heritage studies, becomes something that is a part of common practice. And I think that, though, involves a lot more long-term investment. And I think that's a lot harder for especially these emergency projects to prepare for, because the expectation especially is that these are going to be local capacity building programs, that you just come in, you inject the money, you give whatever necessary training there is there, and then you get back out again, especially in terms of, say, a U.S. foreign aid project. And I don't think that there's been as much of a focus on financial investment for those types of initiatives to make sure that that's successful, such as training site managers to learn how to apply for more grants, or training site managers to file monitoring and evaluation reports. Those types of very basic pieces of administration are not, I think, given a lot of focus in terms of these funding initiatives. it's very much site focused rather than administrative focused, which I think is a
If I
problem.
can follow up a little bit, that would be consonant with USAID types of conventions on capacity building, monitor evaluation. These are all pretty well established ways of working, perhaps not as much in the reconstruction and heritage fields.
Right.
But I'm thinking somewhat also of the kinds of frameworks like Larry Vail's political axioms for reconstruction, on the politics of this and how you actually operationalize the analysis of political aspects in ways that usually aren't discussed explicitly, but he actually is trying to, develop the language where this can be brought in explicitly and be helpful.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if you find that useful at all.
Again, I think that's it's changing in terms of direct applicability to the heritage field, and I think that it's simply because of the fact that for a long time, I mean, it's not. I think only until since the 1970s, 80s or so, I would say that integration of these types of heritage management projects into wider civil society projects or development projects, fully integrative, is something that's relatively new and not as I think is well practiced, I think. And in a conflict situation, it's especially difficult to maintain those types of standards, I would say. So I think that many times, especially heritage managers, what I've seen on the ground is that it's so much easier just to like get what you're doing done and as quickly as possible, and then not try to think about outside, essentially, outside forces interfering with your progress in a way. And I've met so many architectural preservationists who have worked in these types of situations where it's very much focused on nuts and bolts. And so this integration of these wider political considerations is difficult to do. And I think that the problem is heritage managers are not necessarily trained in that way to think about that. And I think once that the field has become again, I don't know what's going to take first. Is it going to take students who are being educated in these matters to take the first step, or is it the people that are on the ground now being forced to adapt and then trickle it down to the future generations? I don't know what, we're in a chicken and an egg situation, I would argue. So I think we're learning. It's still a learning process, and it hasn't been perfected yet, I think is the short answer of it. I hope that answers your question.
Thanks.
Thank you so much for that. I'm still absorbing a lot of it. I'm just going to continue sort of what you just mentioned in terms of community participation, because that's what I wanted to ask about. Because I think that you did mention all of the sort of external organizations, but in terms of, you mentioned that there's a lot of reconstruction that's happening by the people that are there themselves, but on what scale are they, and have they formed like organizations of their own, or are they like what scale is that happening, and what is your plan for community participation engagement in those terms? And I feel like, I do think that the World Bank in specific does have like social mobilization and awareness and community participation as one of the major conditions of beginning.
Right. They do. I think though what I've seen on the ground in terms of the World Bank thing is that many of those types of benchmarks can fall to the wayside, or they can be, in terms of their short-term applicability, be very quickly realized, but the long-term investment in those types of activities sometimes I don't see completely fulfilled in the end. But what I'm seeing, at least in Iraq, in terms of community engagement and mobilization, is a challenging feat, because especially so many of these projects are very centralized and very tightly controlled by the federal government, and then trickles down to regional government, trickles down to the municipality. And so what I've noticed is that there's very little space for green roots activism in a way. And one of the things I've noticed was, this plays out, we'll go back to it, is one of the activists, Mosul, he was supposed to come here last year, but I was unable to. But he had been initiating different types of local actions to collect books, to open new libraries, and he was trying to create a new library to replace the books that were destroyed at Mosul University. And his efforts were halted because he didn't have official approval or sanction to do such work, despite the fact that it's well-intentioned. it was outside the authority of the central administration, and it was quickly shut down. And so I think we're seeing that contrast of people who, especially local citizens, who want to take action in some way and to organize, but are facing a great deal of difficulty because the general way in which a centralized bureaucracy still works is that it very much is a top-down level of control in the implementation of these programs. And as a result, I think looking at the types of programs that are taking place, they're very grand. And that's reflective, I think, of the environment, the political, governmental environment in which they're working within. And so the types of smaller projects, like what we've been seeing, like with Mar Benham, which I think comparatively is a rather small project, is interesting that it was so successful. And I think that one of the reasons why is because, in terms of, from a heritage perspective, a religious heritage site has less authoritative oversight from, say, the minister of government. They have a lot more leeway because they have their own financial endowments. They're not as dependent on the state for funding. So therefore they're able to operate a bit with more latitude as a result. So I think that's what we're going to start seeing in terms of local mobilization is going to start with especially the religious sites and maybe the more the culture-based sites like artist cafes, music halls. Those are where we're going to start. It's not going to start with the very traditional established versions of cultural heritage repositories and managed tourist sites in a way. Does that answer your question? Thanks.
I can come back in. I'd like to know if you have concluded from the inner city area sort of a list of the possible places that could be worked on and restored or not I don't know what you can rebuild, because how would you rebuild it?
Yeah. We do have
How many sites? How is it mosques? Is it libraries? Is it homes?
It's all of that. So we have it separated. So we are thinking in long terms of places that we can work on outside the funding constraints provided by this initial grant that we have. So we're very much interested in looking at especially historic homes. There are a number of historic mosques as well that are on our consideration, but we don't have a ranked hierarchy just yet. We're still I don't want to reveal too much yet because we're still in coordination with local stakeholder groups that are in charge of those sites. So obviously we can't work there unless we're given permission from the authorities. And as demonstrated by Al-Tahriya Church, if you don't openly communicate what you're attempting to do, it results in confrontation. So I think that we have a list, and it's definitely ranked by feasibility in terms of the extent of damage and access, logistical access. And those are the top priorities we're going to start at first. Again, low-hanging fruit. It's going to be easier to start in the areas that are less damaged and more accessible than it is at a place like, for us, at our scale, Al Nouri. We only have $2 million, and Al Nouri has been given $50 million, and I don't even think that's going to be enough. It's a very small amount of money, so we're going to try to make small miracles in a way. So we're working on it. We're in our first phase, so we're sorting that side of it out.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.